Today's presenter is Annick de Witt. Annick is an author, the founding director of the Worldview Journeys Foundation, and affiliated with Utrecht University as a researcher and educator. She is also the co-creator of our Worldview questionnaire that many of you may have taken at some point. And I'm just honored to introduce Annick. So Annick, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rigel. And all of you, it's so lovely to be here with this special group. It's in the middle of the night here in the Netherlands, but I'm really glad I get to share this space with you. I have a big story. I hope I can kind of fit it all in. So I have a presentation I'm gonna screen share with you. Yeah, and so also, thank you so much, guys, for giving me this opportunity to talk about this topic and this essay that I started writing last winter. It was around the shortest day of the year, really kind of contemplating the situation we're in. And I could summarize this big question that I started thinking about as how did we get here and where should we be going? And so with here, I am speaking to the search of the far right, and then the empowerment of the far right populism in the West and even beyond, the decimation of the left, and also these stubborn culture wars that have been raging for decades now, and that really sabotage us to tackle any of any of humanity's great challenges. And when I'm saying we, I'm speaking from the left. I would see myself as kind of center left and to the left. And I know that these terms are contentious and perhaps outdated, left and right. We've seen so many position reversals and so many changes. But I still think when we want to orient ourselves in the political landscape, these are actually still useful terms. And so when I'm speaking about the left and the right, I'm using these terms in a general orienting sense, with the left referring to the parties that tend to prioritize protecting the public good and enlisting the government to do so. And when I'm speaking about the right, I'm referring to parties that tend to prioritize protecting individual freedoms and restraining government. And so I have been studying worldviews for a long time, did a PhD on that, and kind of, yeah, just this fascination that keeps on going. And so I adopted a worldview lens to start thinking about these big questions. And a worldview lens is particularly powerful, I think, for three reasons. In the first place, it really allows us to contemplate the deeper origins of our political battles. It helps us to kind of penetrate the underlying ideas and values and assumptions that we don't actually often talk that much about, but that are still really drivers of our political positions, movements, and battles. And then secondly, a worldview lens really allows us to kind of zoom out and get a larger perspective, a big picture view, recognizing overarching patterns and trends. And I think this is particularly useful in our contemporary kind of cultural landscape that is so incredibly complex. We kind of need to see the forest for the trees a little bit. And then thirdly, really important, it allows us to do actually some critical self-examination. And here again, I'm speaking primarily to the left. It allows us to ask ourselves this question, like, is our worldview still serving us? Or does it actually need to adapt and change? And a very useful foundation to start thinking about worldview has been developed by Max Weber, who is the founder or co-founder of the field of sociology and of kind of social science at large as we know it today. And he was also an early voice pointing out how our conceptions of the cosmic universe really shape the social economic organization of our societies. And he understood worldview as a system of meaning. So you can think of a worldview as kind of a big story that in a somewhat coherent way somewhat coherent, overarching way answers these fundamental existential life questions for us. Questions like, who are we, as creatures? What kind of creatures are we? What are we doing here? What is reality, and how can we know reality? What does it mean to live a good life? What is of value? How should we organize our society, etc.? And he understood the central function of worldviews to provide humans with a sense of meaning and stability, so we can kind of manage our lives and feel that our lives make sense. So it's the function to provide a sense of meaning making satisfaction. And even though these worldviews are immaterial, right? They live in our minds and our hearts, they live in our language and our stories. They are quite powerful in the material sense and on our world. As Richard Tarnas has said, worldviews create worlds. So I really treat them as potent cultural and psychological forces that inform and mobilize people and end up creating and recreating the systems we're surrounded by: legal systems, economic systems, political systems. And when I'm speaking about worldviews, and particularly the categorization in different worldviews, I like to think of it in terms of ideal types. And this, again, is a Weberian concept. And so an ideal type is a kind of a logically constructed framework, or a logical or a rationally constructed, or a rational construct that doesn't quite exist as such in the messiness of our really complex social reality, but it does help us to investigate that social reality. So it is a heuristic that helps us understand and make sense. And it's also good to know that, or how I understand these worldviews, is that they arise as a response to the issues and to the questions of their time, especially when older worldviews can't provide the answers anymore. They can't solve the problems of our time anymore, and then new worldviews tend to emerge. And so each worldview really brings certain qualities, insights, achievements, new solutions, while also, generating their own problems. And these worldviews also can become caricatures. And I think we see that particularly clearly today in our, kind of really hyper-polarized landscape. And I think it's fair to say that today there's three worldviews that dominate our cultural landscape, and that's a more traditional worldview, a more modern worldview, and a more postmodern worldview. And in these images, both of them, you see fourth worldviews, and you see a fourth one, and that's, perhaps the worldview that can help us actually give answers and provide new solutions for the problem of today, but it is still more emerging and not quite as widely recognized as the other three are, in fields like, in fields like sociology and philosophy. Because these first three worldviews are really widely recognized. And we've actually, myself and a couple of colleagues, have done some work to kind of empirically show, on the basis of survey research, that these worldviews exist and coexist, and also that they have significantly different relationships with opinions, with behaviors, and with political priorities. So now back to that question of, how did we get here? Why this, kind of global search of this right-wing or this far-right populism? I think if you look at the literature around populism, you'll find that there's two major deep causes that tend to be recognized. And the first one is the most widely recognized one, and that's the economic insecurity. And so populism is seen, is understood as a reaction to particularly neoliberal policies of the 80s that left the lower educated classes vulnerable and abandoned. And so that creates resentment and pushback, and that explains populism. But culture and economics are deeply intertwined. And that was a point that Weber already made. And so populism also has to be seen as a reaction against the cultural changes, and particularly the cultural changes of, say, the last half century, that threaten people, particularly with more traditional worldviews. And Engelhardt and Norris, in the paper that you see here on the right, published this work in 2016, where they show really on on the basis of a lot of really interesting sociological data that these value changes that have occurred since the 60s, 70s, where substantial parts of the population in Western countries have started shifting from more modern to more postmodern worldviews. We see a shift towards more cosmopolitan mindsets, more progressive values. We see all kinds of social movements emerge, women's rights, gay rights, environmental movements, nuclear disarmament, a whole civil rights movement, a whole range of movements that start to push new issues into politics and that give expression to a different worldview. And the point that Engelhardt and Norris make is that that was experienced as very threatening to people with more traditional worldviews that used to be the dominant worldview and that now felt their worldview being under attack, being under assault. And that being then further amplified by forces of immigration, and my culture is under attack, and then also other people, other cultures are coming in and they speak different language and kind of exacerbating that sense of my worldview is under attack. And so I think we can understand today's culture wars really as an existential battle between different worldviews. And James Davison Hunter, he wrote this book, Culture Wars, in 1991, or published it in 1991. He was actually the first to adapt the concept, the German concept of Kulturkampf, culture war, to the American context. And he distinguished between two polarized camps. And so he talked about the orthodox versus the progressives, or as we would say, traditionals versus postmoderns, struggling with each other to define America. And he really emphasized that this is not just a class conflict with different social economic groups standing in opposition of each other. This is really a battle between different worldviews, different understandings of morality, of reality, of what it means to live a good life. And he gives the example of gay rights, right? So for one group, this is like gay rights is an attack on the sanctity of the traditional family, the cornerstone, itself seen as the cornerstone of society. While for the other group, this is a victory over oppressive systems. So same issue, completely different understandings and interpretations. So really two different worlds that also, talk past each other. And both they attack each other, but they also both attack the modern worldview. And I think we've seen that increasing over the past decades. So I'm going to focus on the postmodern worldview and how that plays out in leftist politics. But before we can turn to the postmodern worldview, we have to, understand a little bit better about this modern worldview, because that's really what the postmodern worldview emerged in response to. And so, the modern worldview, we all know this worldview. It has created so much progress. Arguably, it's been wildly successful, especially through its advances in science and technology. It has lengthened our lifespans and created all kinds of medical advances, and also really transformed our daily life and our daily experience, at least for many people across the globe. And so on the one hand, this worldview has been really successful. At the same time, it has brought a lot of problems. And one of them is this objectification of nature. This is a materialist, mechanistic, objectivist worldview that views nature as an object that we can exploit for our own purposes. And so Weber spoke about the disenchantment of the world and the stripping of nature of its symbolic value, its spiritual value, its intrinsic value, and leaving it as an object to be exploited. And many environmental philosophers have argued that this is actually at the heart of the ecological crisis or the global environmental crisis. But this worldview also created a kind of cosmic alienation, because as conscious, subjective, human-making meaning-making humans as we are now standing in opposition and are kind of at odds with the the materialistic and the mechanistic world that science describes. There's a distance there that is hard to bridge. We are kind of the oddity in the universe, the big exception. This is all mechanistic and that matter, and here we are, these conscious meaning-making beings. And the philosophy of mind has also kind of emphasized this and how actually we can't, from this framework, we cannot really explain our human experience. And this is called the hard problem of consciousness. And then the political philosophy of this worldview, liberalism and neoliberalism, and associated with the capitalist model, exacerbated the wealth gap, which created its own problems, and also this competitive individualism, this hyper-consumerism, has coincided, and I think we've increasingly started to see that in the last few decades, coincided with stress and alienation and loneliness and ill health. So I think it's fair to say that this worldview actually can't do anymore what it should be doing, namely providing humans with a sense of meaning-making satisfaction. And that dissatisfaction, that inability to deliver on this most important function is what started, or at least what contributed to the emerging postmodern alternative. And so the postmodern worldview, it's very critical and it's very skeptical. And I think that's both its superpower and its downfall. And so it really questions all these typically modern concepts, rationality, objectivity, truth, the idea of meta-narratives, the idea of progress. And it sees reality as socially constructed through paradigms and discourses. So there's no objective reality out there that we can study as was assumed in the modern worldview, but it is socially and subjectively constructed. And the postmodern worldview actually leaves open what then reality is, the kind of what the ontological status of the world is. It leaves that ambiguous, unknown. That emphasizes ambiguity, irony, uncertainty, relativity, fluidity, but it kind of refuses to commit itself in a metaphysical sense as to what reality is then. And so in this postmodern world, there are no objective truths. There are no intrinsic values. There are no universal perspectives. There are no higher purposes. And, knowledge is local, it's contextual, it's subjective, it's relative, it's constructive. And any grand story of life, mind, or the universe is suspect and seen as an attempt at power and dominance, exploitation. And so on the one hand, I think this is very liberating and emancipating, and we've seen that, especially in the early years, how this is, really an emancipatory force. And we see these movements, we start to question how we are constructing the world, and as we do that, possibilities open up. We can actually also construct it in another way. We can question these frameworks and, construct other frameworks. And the popular idea that you can create your own reality or you can write your own story. And so that's very empowering, but at the same time, it also slips into nihilism and anti-realism. Yeah, it's a very relativistic perspective. We cannot, from this worldview, we cannot say that one perspective is better than another one. If we would do that, we would presume that there's some kind of objective viewpoint or some kind of universal perspective, and that doesn't exist within this worldview, within the framework of this worldview. And so, we're kind of bound to this nihilism. And ultimately, what that does is that the postmodern worldview ends up eroding truth and eroding our sense of meaning and purpose. And we see this very clearly today, right? Arguably, this worldview has created the foundation for the post-truth world that we see today, and also for the meaning crisis and the sense of purposelessness and alienation that is so ever present in our societies. And I think this connection is really important to see also from a perspective of left-wing politics. And so the postmodern worldview, in that sense, also starts to sabotage its own ability to provide humans with a sense of meaning, which is, again, kind of its most important function. And then if we start to look more at like kind of postmodernism in practice and postmodernism in politics, how does this play out? So on the one hand, I think lot of progress, but also some very real losses. So this rallying cry of this worldview and of the kind of postmodern left is inclusion. And inclusion is, of course, a laudable ideal. But as I argue in my essay, the problem with many postmodern projects is not what they attempt to include, but rather what they exclude in the process. And so the postmodern left has tended to deny these losses and ascribe any pushback over these losses to merely bigotry. It's just racism or it's just sexism, thereby disqualifying and excluding our opponents. And I'll come with three kind of policy positions that hopefully make this more clear how this has been played out. But I think you recognize this pattern. And this, of course, resulted in a really stifling cancel culture that does not allow for dissent, that antagonized major parts of the population, and that blocked any kind of constructive, inclusive policy development, kind of made it impossible for us to come to actually better policy positions because we've canceled every dissenting voice. And I think one important context here to kind of keep in mind as we go into these policy positions is that this is the time of worldview wars, and what these kind of polarization dynamics do is that they radicalize us, I think, across the board. Not necessarily every individual, but if we look at society at large, we have all radicalized because polarization coincides with radicalization, and worldviews become ideological. So instead of being kind of an open worldview, or at least a worldview that is as a view that is dimly aware that it's not the only view and that there are potentially other insightful or valid viewpoints, we become ideological and we start to assert our position as the only correct view and the all explanatory view, where detractors need to be ostracized and where the in-group is favored. And so we get really quite aggressive, warlike polarization dynamics in which it also becomes increasingly hard to hold any kind of little bit more complicated or more complex or nuanced position. And we see this when we step out of that box of, our sides, and we start to formulate a little bit different sense. Our own side will say, "Nah, you're a traitor. You're the enemy. You're actually with the other side." And so, where in theory we could have, perhaps or possibly limitless views on a certain topic, we end up with this political binary trap where there's only two positions possible. You're for or against, and we've seen this across so many societal debates. And there's also a clear psychology here that we need to be aware of, that we need to be aware of, because people tend to protect their worldviews, and this is actually natural and sensible and understandable because these worldviews provide these really important functions for us, right? They give us a sense that life is meaningful, sensible, stable, manageable. And so if we start to challenge that, we may actually kind of create an instant psychological crisis or an existential crisis. And so there's kind of a danger lurking there. And we see this in all the kind of biases that our mind has, like confirmation bias, to kind of shut out and repress or ignore any challenges to our dominant paradigms, to our assumptions. And this also has physiological dimensions, right? So from the perspective of the organism, not even from our conscious self, but challenges to our worldview may be perceived as a threat. And this may set off a physiological threat response where our organism, again, not necessarily our conscious self, starts to prioritize kind of survival we get into a fight, flight, freeze mode and shutting down any higher cognitive functions that don't contribute directly to survival, like self-reflection, like learning. And we see this in our debates, right? We are not in this open space of exploration. We are in this hyper-vigilant space. We are getting triggered and we're reactive. And so I think this is kind of the cultural context that really also helps us appreciate and understand how, this postmodern worldview that emerged, many ways so idealistic and so noble, and became arguably quite ideological and problematic. And one way that, or one policy position that, of course, has really fueled the far right movement is this globalist politics, open borders and open trade. And for a long time, this was, considered to be just fantastic for society, right? And there were no losses, and actually, if you were against this, then you were probably a racist or a bigot, and that could be that that was the only reason that you could be against more open borders and more open trade. And of course, that is what the far right has pushed back against, and we see this in Trump. Build a wall, secure the border, put tariffs, all aimed at walling off what's inside the country from outsiders. And I think we have seen a bit of a paradigm shift here where we've started to recognize also on the left and amongst intellectual elites that it's not all good. There have been real losses, and we need to recognize those, and we need to work with those in a different way. And then the third, or the second issue, this identity politics and the way we have tried to kind of protect minorities. And so, if you look at the modern approach to racism and discrimination, this is mainly to emphasize the individual, basically saying the group is not that important. We value you for who you are as an individual, for the content of your character, for your personal merits. So this is related to meritocracy and an emphasis on self-determination and self-responsibility, really emphasizing the individual. The idea of color blindness, for example. Postmodern thinkers, though, found this approach really inadequate. Inadequate to address the deep-seated nature of racism and discrimination more generally. And it started to emphasize, how racism, discrimination, how they are systemic and in many ways invisible. Introducing concepts like unconscious bias and societal narratives, and arguing how these actually structurally disadvantage certain groups. And I think, this is also, we see more clearly now, this is a really important advance in our understanding. And I think postmodern thinkers had a really good point here that needs to be recognized. But the downside is that it tended to make racism all pervasive and unverifiable, and maybe even more problematic, really dividing societies into dominant versus marginalized identities, the colonizers versus the colonized, oppressors versus the oppressed, masters versus slaves, and thereby kind of entrenching this tendency to conceive of people as groups in balkanized opposition. I just saw a quote or someone on LinkedIn, and then 600 likes, someone saying, racism was invented by white people, as was slavery. And that's historically incorrect, but it's also kind of doing exactly what you're accusing others of. You're making a whole group responsible for the acts of certain individuals, and this is really the entrenchment where we get this intense focus on identity-based groups, but there is a loss on the level of the individual. We don't quite recognize the individual anymore, as well as the universal. And I think this also related to the anti-essentialist tendency of the postmodern worldview, which doesn't actually it rejects the idea that either both the world and the self have an intrinsic nature. And if you reject that idea, you can't really recognize this kind of shared humanity, this human nature that binds us all. And so in many ways, this was an advance, I think, what postmodernism and postmodern thinkers brought in addressing the issues, but there was also a big loss, and arguably in many ways creating more divisiveness than the healing that is needed and would be helpful to our societies. And I think we see something, again, very similar happening with the gender politics and the loss of sex. And so this idea that gender is just a social construct, of course, is itself a very postmodern notion, right? This is the postmodern worldview speaking. But the issue here is that gender is not added, it's not an extra layer of understanding. No, it comes to replace sex. At least that's, I think, what the almost the official policy position in the left and what transgender activists have pushed for. There's this idea of a gender self-determination. This means that you get to determine yourself, based on your inner feeling, on your subjective feeling, what your gender is. And this overrides what your sex is up to the point that you can change your birth certificate, or you can actually have, as sex in your passport, your gender identification. And so gender comes to fully replace sex. And this is, of course, a very questionable idea, and it goes against to what humans have understood since time immemorial and universally across cultures, namely that there are significant differences between men and women, and that these have real world consequences in how we organize our societies and how we relate to each other. And just erasing that and then calling everyone who disagrees a transphobe, which is a little bit kind of what the left has done here, is, when we reflect on that, we shouldn't be surprised the pushback we've gotten, especially again from people with more traditional worldviews. Now, some people also argue, yeah, this issue is not so important because it affects only so many people. That's, I think, debatable in itself. But also that doesn't really appreciate how just a kind of erasing sex and how fundamental this is to how people understand their world and their life, how doing that rattles people's worldviews. And so, yeah, I think this is three ways that we can, or three policy positions where we can see that the left, by and large, has made some progress, created losses, tended to deny these losses, and tended to accuse or blame or judge anyone not agreeing to these losses. And then there's also, one way all of this has come to expression very strongly, of course, is this policing of language. And also this kind of focus, this obsession with language is itself a very postmodern idea again. As in postmodernism tends to see language not to reflect reality, but to create reality. And so if language create reality and we want to change culture, we should be changing language. And so we've had, a culture pretty obsessed with all kinds of changes and almost replacing real material world activism for language changes and imposing them on people and canceling anyone who doesn't quite use the right term. And yeah, and what is so interesting about this, or what has been so astounding to me personally, is not just that this happened on, by activist groups, but the way and the degree to which particularly progressive institutions kind of bought into this. Yeah, so the medical establishment adopting a term like sex assigned at birth, which is just factually a problematic term and not very scientific and descriptive of reality. Or how, in institutions it became very almost required to declare your gender in your email signature. And these things really show how there's been kind of an institutional realignment where these institutions that used to be built around Enlightenment, modern values, objectivism, rationalism, universalism, were now replaced by or shifted toward, at least partially, these really postmodern values, constructivism, social activism, relativism. And so these changes are really quite profound and understandably also quite upsetting to people with different worldviews. And I think as the left, we haven't quite recognized, one, the degree that this has taken place. And that's partially also, that's what worldviews do, right? They are kind of blinders. We assume that this is the world, and so we don't quite see that actually we have changed a lot. And yeah, we need to have some understanding for people with different worldviews that are not in on all this. And also, I think if you look at how we've handled these issues as the left, I think it's fair to say that there's been real kind of cultish tendencies, ideological tendencies, and punishing anyone who doesn't fully agree, not allowing dissent. And so I don't agree with much with Elon Musk on much, but I think he's actually right. There is something like the woke mind virus. And if you doubt, I'd recommend watching that movie or the documentary by Matt Walsh, What is a Woman? And it's really eye-opening. And it really shows how, there's so much groupthink and lack of critical thinking and lack of openness to other perspectives and how damaging that is to ourselves ultimately. Oh yeah, and of course, that's another thing I wanted to say here is, I think we also underestimate, or we tend to underestimate how powerful and how harmful this has been to our own electoral success. Arguably, there are few things that have fueled and invigorated the right like wokeism has. So yeah, very important. We really start to pay more attention to this. And I think what we see, and this, of course, the worldview wash, both sides have become much more extreme. So these polarization dynamics have radicalized all of us. Conservative parties used to stretch really from traditional to modern worldview with fiscal and social or social and fiscal conservatives. And progressive parties really used to stretch from more modern and postmodern to more postmodern worldviews and have now become much more, just ideologically postmodern, while conservative parties have become more kind of singularly traditionalist, nativist, isolationist, anti-NATO, anti-big corporations, and so the modern worldview is hollowed out in this process. And I think we also see that we've all become a little bit more impenetrable to rational thinking and rationality and empowering these dynamics. Yeah, and this is a very schematic, simplified picture, of course. If we really dive into the cultural landscape, we see so much complexity, and we see a lot of mirroring, a lot of projection. I think Trump is, of course, himself a master of projection, but also on the left, we have done this. We've had our own version of what John McWhorter calls woke racism, which is, is accusing others of what we do ourselves. And so we've seen all these complex dynamics that we also can understand through these psychological concepts, the Freudian concept of projection, the Jungian concept of the shadow, and we've seen complete position reversals. Right, with the left becoming the party that champions the FBI, and the right becoming the anti-establishment party. So there's a lot of complexity here and shifts, but overall, I think the picture kind of holds. And then if we look at the election results, I think David Brooks had such an interesting piece right after the election in the New York Times, arguing that, if we look at these election results, so Trump building this multiracial coalition, with Asians and blacks and Latinos increasing their support for him, first from 2016 to 2020, and then again from 2020 to 24. All the while, he is running on an anti-immigration platform and promising mass deportations. So Brooks basically said this is an anomaly. These are data that challenge the basic assumptions of our paradigm, of our identitarian paradigm. And so we need to actually craft a new cultural worldview or new paradigm. I thought that was a really interesting call coming from David Brooks. And I would agree with that. We need to craft a new political paradigm. And my argument would be that it is some combination of the principles of cultural moderation plus economic populism. And if we would hold both of these, so cultural moderation is a response to the cultural backlash, that I started this presentation with, that helps us understand populism. And the economic populism is a response to the economic insecurity that is at the heart or at the root of this right-wing populism. And if we really include, so if we're really inclusive and live up to our own ideals, if we really include diverse perspectives in society, we don't end up with extremist viewpoints. We end up with some culturally moderate positions, right? That's just by definition. And I think the same counts. If we really include diverse socioeconomic groups in society, we come to some version of economic populism. And so we don't need to abandon our core values, which I've noticed is a kind of a big anxiety on the left, but we actually need to live up to them. We need to actually become much more inclusive. And this will also allow us to build a new, much more broad coalition. We have not been very good coalition builders. We have kind of alienated and rejected anyone who doesn't fully agree with us or has a slightly different perspectives. But if we really want to formulate answers to the problems of our time, we need to build really broad coalitions. And to do that, we kind of need to look beyond our own worldviews. We need to get over ourselves a little bit. And so, actually, there's a newly emerging worldview that that provides a basis for all this, as it moves beyond and holds both sides of this polarity, of the left-right polarity, and it integrates former seemingly mutually exclusive opposites in a deeper whole. And it integrates the great insights and achievements of each worldviews, and also very importantly, I haven't spoken that much about it. But the modern and the postmodern worldview both have contributed to the sense of meaning crisis. And the secularist worldview is just not fulfilling clearly to a great part of the population. And so we also need to restore the sense of enchantment, that life is sacred, that there is higher purpose, and valuing community and communality. And also, this worldview need to empower each one of us to play a meaningful role in this, massive, this poly crisis or this meta crisis that we face. And then one very last note here before I end. So we've also been doing some very concrete work to actually contribute to, you could say, all of this. And so together with Utrecht University, we have developed a transformative learning trajectory that we call the Worldview Journey that actually supports students to explore, reflect on their own worldviews, to exchange with those of other worldviews, and to kind of expand their worldviews. And we've seen really promising and hope-giving results of students really kind of having aha experiences like, oh, wow, a worldview. Ah, yeah, I see now. Ah, yeah, other views. Interesting. And like, seeds of a little bit of intellectual humility, curiosity about other perspectives, reflection about where their worldviews come from. Really beautiful results. So also some quite practical ways that we can work towards these aims. Thank you so much for your attention.
All right. Thank you, Annick. What a lovely presentation.
I hope that was not way too long.
Oh, no, it's perfect. You're
Good.
right on time. So let's open it up for just general discussion. Um, if you have a question, anything that resonates with you, anything you disagree with, challenge and support is welcome here. We're not all left of center, so I want to
hmm
just make sure there's space for that. And yeah, so go ahead and click the react button, raise hand, and we'll call on you. Let's start with Steve McIntosh.
Thank you, Rigel. And thank you very much, Annick. That was really excellent. I really appreciated all your points. I learned a couple of things. I agreed with almost everything you said. Um, I guess my question is, you showed Weber at the beginning, and his contribution to the concept of worldviews and how worldviews give you a kind of a perspective on the cosmos. And I just want to run by you what you think of the following, and that is, one of the elements of this worldview lens that I would, suggest as an addition is that from a cosmic perspective, these are actually the structures of noosphere evolution or noosphere, right? That is the
Yeah,
noosphere is a layer of evolution, and evolution is continuing within it. And as we see evolution across, from the Big Bang, cosmological, biological, psychosocial, it's characterized by steps and stages. It's how systems develop at every level. And these systemic patterns of growth continue in the process of noosphere evolution. Not that it's a deterministic process, but it's evolution nonetheless. So
yeah,
when we're thinking about these processes of evolution, one of the things that I found particularly illuminating in my own way of thinking about progressive postmodernism specifically is to see the action of dialectical development, right? So, you mentioned that these worldviews are in kind of a dialectical relationship with each other. And although it's been critiqued, it's still a very useful, kind of a handy simplification of dialectical development to think about it in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right?
sure.
And, and,
Yeah,
and the more I apply that lens to worldview development, the more I really can see how, wow, more than ever, postmodernism clearly represents, what Hegel called the moment of antithesis, right? This move of
yeah,
antithesis. We know we need to transcend modernity, right? And postmodernism shows us the first step and what that means. But of course, the antithesis is unstable. The antithesis is a kind of a bridge between two more stable moments. And one of the things that you can kind of see in almost every form of antithesis in dialectical development is that it oversolves. In other words, it
yeah,
breaks out and it
yeah,
does the job of the antithesis, and then it has nowhere else to go. So it just keeps being antithetical in a way that it becomes self-destructive. And these are actually, even though we're definitely hurting socially and politically from many of these oversolving tropes that you laid out, uh, uh, it seems to me that these are actually golden opportunities, doorways or points of departure for this next worldview. And again, using this construct of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, if we can see that what this next worldview has to be according to this dialectical developmental logic, which is a synthesis, right? And so you
yes,
mentioned, right, of course, there's a synthesis involved in economic populism and cultural moderation. But if it's going to be a new worldview, it can't just be, a political remedy. It's got to be something more exciting, something more
yes. Yep.
identity worthy, something that has this kind of world historical momentum of this next great phase of noosphere evolution. So that's a mouthful, but I wonder if you think about it in terms of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and what this idea of synthesis might add to this concept of the next worldview.
Yeah, I mean, I can only say I fully agree pretty much with everything you said, or it really resonates for me. I think, yeah, so yeah, the left kind of pushed itself in a way, and both extremes, they hardly can go any more extreme. And, the new worldview has to move beyond both and hold both, integrate both. And so I think that's your synthesis. And that's also the restoration of the enchantment and yeah, really kind of understanding humanity and nature in a new way, subject and object, science and religion, or science and spirituality, is bringing all those together. And that's, of course, intellectually and actually spiritually and in an embodied sense, that's a real challenge, and that's a big step. That's perhaps also why, you know, yeah, as I said in the start, I started writing this essay with this worldly question on my mind. How did we get here, and where should we be going? And so I wanted to also make it concrete, and that's why I ended on this cultural moderation and economic populism, um, as I feel that really that actually responds to the problem that we're seeing, the deep causes of this far right populism. It responds to that, and perhaps we can only also successfully do that through the synthesis that you describe. So, if we're in this extremism, we can't actually come to these culturally moderate position. And I think actually, I've been quite a little bit shocked by that. Like after all these elections and these results and these kind of slaps in our face that we've had, again and again and again, at least that's how I've experienced it. And, I see so many people on the left basically saying, just keep going. We're right. Woke is fantastic. And everybody just has to become woke. And, you know, a new worldview actually, the movement of a new worldview is what allows us to move beyond our extremism and come to this more synthetic perspective, I guess. Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Thanks.
Right.
Thanks for the question. Yeah.
Let's go to Ross, Ben, and then Michael.
Annick, I just wanted to thank you so much for coming in with us in what must be 2 o'clock in the morning where you are. And
Yes.
you're presenting brilliantly for that late at night, and also expressing so clearly what we've been discussing here for years.
Yes, of course.
So I want to just thank you, and I would love to have a copy of your presentation if you're able to make it available. It's very clear, and I want to thank you for that. My question really comes with where you were concluding at the end of your presentation, with the words, the creation of a wider whole, or a deeper whole, I think was what you were saying. And it's not a deeper HOLE, it's a deeper WHOLE, a deeper whole, a wider whole. And
Yes.
I'd like to get your views about how wholes are created. Part of integral theory is that that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We're all built out of holons and
Yeah.
emerge out of a context. But obviously, one way to do it is to have a holistic set of constructs. But I wonder if you've thought about the creation of wholes and how we might proceed in creating a deeper and perhaps a wider one.
Hmm. Well, to some degree, I think it's also actually recognizing, just recognizing that there is a deeper reality where, and this is the kind of paradoxical nature, perhaps, of this new worldview, where we start to see that these things that we considered mutually exclusive are actually um, are actually part of a greater unity, a deeper interconnectedness, and I think we can see the movement towards that in our culture. I don't know if that answers your question a little bit, or if you want to probe me further.
Well, I want everybody else to ask their question. Yeah, there are other sub questions I'd like to ask, but I am going to stop there so everybody gets a chance. Thank you.
And one more thing I'd like to say is that, yeah, I really wanted to write this essay because I know that I have probably said many things that all of you already know and have known for a long time. My attempt with this essay also was really to speak to a larger audience and to, really to speak to the left. And so I try to build it in a way that can take people along who don't know integral theory, haven't read Wilbur, and so yeah.
Yeah, I thought you did an excellent job kind of leading people in and then adding some pretty good self-reflection at the end that I imagine stings a little bit to someone who hasn't experienced integral work before. Thank you. All right, Ben, and then Michael and David.
Yes, thank you, Annick. That was really wonderful for what we would call a secular audience, as opposed to a bunch of integralists like we have here. I come from the background of spiral dynamics and Claire Graves and Don Beck. So and everything that theory proposes, you have articulated nicely in language other than the spiral language, which we definitely appreciate. One comment I would make is that Graves proposed that our worldviews are related to our perceptions of our life conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And so as our life conditions are perceived as downshifting, and we can all agree in this room that life conditions for most of us, for many of us, are perceived as downshifting, our values naturally downshift with them in order to cope.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is until we reach, in a sense, green, or even start to get exiting green, entering what we would call integral in spiral dynamics yellow terms, where conscious evolution actually becomes relevant, becomes salient, becomes one of the reasons that it becomes our key meaning making. We want to evolve
Yes.
our consciousness.
Yeah.
So the masses will have a tendency to be downshifting, and you can see that happening way, down to purple and red and all those. We're just showing up in spades here. And so what we're inviting is an evolution to, in a sense, a second tier integral process, which acknowledges all the first tier values and appreciates and does the mesh working, etc. So I just want to honor that while we all are encouraging ourselves to evolve our consciousness, our tendency, human tendencies, is to downshift. And so part of that is this how to get the momentum going. So we want to upshift rather than, because we don't necessarily, if we were right now thrown into these life conditions of radical whatever, we would all be downshifting too. We have a hard time imagining ourselves being able to upshift if there was caca happening at this moment. I just want to acknowledge that perspective taking is really handy, and see if you have any thoughts about that. Thank you.
Sorry, is really?
I'm sorry?
I missed your very last half sentence.
If you have any thoughts about that, thanks.
Oh, okay. Yes. Yeah. 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 So you mean downshifting, like kind of regressing or degrading in our values or understanding? Yeah. 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 I like to think of it in terms of vicious versus virtuous cycles. As we have all experienced this in our own lives, I think, right? You can get into a vicious cycle, and I feel in many ways in the world we are in vicious cycles, and we're just downgrading, and we're just degrading and sliding back and with every slide down, we slide down further, or the downsliding is further empowered. And so somehow we need to get into these virtuous cycles, because I've experienced this in my own life, and maybe other ones have here. We can get into another stream somehow where we get into we start to upshift, and when we do that, it becomes a little bit easier the next time, and I think probably both will be happening on our planet. We will probably really see both in really stark ways. And I think I already see this in my own environment. Like the world is in such disarray, and there's so much suffering and so much despair. And yet I increasingly also see pockets of people really thriving, really thriving. And I think also, this if there's if the leadership, if there's an elite that can stand up and that can pull people with us and that can help people to come along, we may be able to do that. And there's, of course, a million kind of practical ways that we can support that. All our practices, and there's so many ways actually that we can make life better and easier, and that we can help people, and that people can grow and evolve. And we have all the solutions also. right? Or, I don't know about all of them, but we have so many solutions. There's so many amazing things that we can do to make our planet better. And we're just not really implementing them at scale because our political priorities are not there. And so,
Thank you.
yeah, hopefully some kind of shift will come. And hopefully we can contribute to that as people have a little bit more of the luxury, and we can use that privilege actually to help others and to help the whole, I guess. Yeah. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Michael, David, and then Steve.
First of all, thank you for this wonderful presentation. And it so much resonates with my thinking about this. But I have a couple of questions. First, what you described, it looks pretty similar, but different from what Farid Zakaria, who is a pretty known journalist here in the United States, he proposed the following, that maybe this old contradiction between left and right, which still exists, as you said correctly, but now it is a part of this new fight between traditional liberalism based on humanistic ideas and populism. And populism can further be differentiated between the left and the right populism that feeding into each other often.
Yeah.
So what do you think about this idea? And my even
let's start with that one question, okay, Michael?
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure because I have not read that Fareed Zakaria on that. I know that he had a lot of good criticism on the left, but especially in terms of governance. He's talking about how, actually people are moving out of blue states and how this has to do with how the left governs. And, I think Ezra Klein's new book is also really speaking to that. So I haven't heard him speak so much about the really cultural dimension. So I'm not sure if I'm catching your idea correctly.
Yeah, he wrote the whole book about this, the age of revolutions.
Oh, yes, actually, that I have not read it, but I've heard about it. Yeah.
But a bigger question is that first I hope that somehow your slides or maybe the recording will be made available. But let's be honest, you're preaching to the choir, right? So most people here already generally agree with you. But the question is how to get it to more people, because this radical left and right populist ideas, they could be wrong, they could be divisive, but they are also appealing. So they make people excited. And traditional
Michael, I'm going to
liberal
interrupt you right there, Michael, because I want to make sure everyone else has a chance to ask a question, okay? All right, we're going to go to David, Steve, and then Steve. Steve Richardson, then Steve Hayes. All right, go for it, David.
Thank you, Virgil. Thanks, Annick. Lovely presentation. Really enjoyed the nuance and complexity and the nice balance of challenging and supporting all of our worldviews here. So deep appreciation for that. What I'm particularly intrigued by is how well you articulated the concept that Thomas Morton talks about as a hyperobject, that's something so big that we're embedded in it, we can't really see it in a sort of objective capacity. So even as we're trying to work on it, we're bound to be working in it. And I'm curious your thoughts on how much of our individual efforts to work in it can contribute to perhaps a latent emergence that Ross kind of mentioned, or with Steve's dialectical dynamic that's already in process. Kind of if we're in the stream and we're in the current, like where do we paddle to most effectively and efficiently get to where that emergent value sphere can pop? I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, perhaps, I don't know if I have a good response to that, but perhaps, and maybe actually to some degree, the election results of last year are kind of poking through our worldviews, right? I do think that, I mean, there was a little bit of this, I think after Trump's 2016 election, that there's a kind of a self-reflective and phase that the left goes through. But now the threat is so acute and so real and so all pervasive and all powerful. I think we don't really have another way anymore, and it doesn't mean that we're still stuck in it to such a great degree. But I'm hoping, I'm thinking that the time may be just right. I don't know. That's my sense. I don't know if this even responds to what you're saying, but that's just what comes to me right now. That's also really when I was writing this essay, this feeling that I was getting, like, I have the feeling that the world is right for another, this kind of message in a new way, as it hasn't been before. We are ready for a new worldview. The modern worldview has been rejected. Now the postmodern worldview, arguably, the election results that people have said, we don't want this. This doesn't do the job. And this is also what I like about Weber. He thinking about worldviews quite functionally. Does it provide us with a sense of meaning, stability, meaning-making satisfaction? If it doesn't do that, we will ultimately look further.
Amen. All right. Let's go to Steve Richardson and then Steve Hayes.
Thank you so much. Like Steve McIntosh, I agree with virtually everything you said, Annick, and great contribution. The pattern that I see, and I'm just going to suggest that probably one of the fatal flaws, I guess, of the approach of progressives or the left is buying into the binary framing of everything. Even the name it's the left and right and progressive. Oh, we're moving forward, and they want to take it backwards. That kind of thing. And so, what I think we need is the paradigm shift that gets us out of this binary worldview that's really overarching both sides. The tribalism is just going to get worse if we go back. It's seen as a back and forth, and us and them. And another example, a little more specific, is the double-edged sword. You said at the outset, the left views government as a tool for good. Well, now we're seeing that sword working against us, right? So to buy into like the use of force to get what we want, it just and wait for revenge, that again, it just keeps us. Just your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah. I just one thought about the binary thing, because I think actually postmodernism is very critical of the binaries and of the modern binaries, right? The modern worldview created this intensely dualistic framework where humanity stands in opposition of nature, and the subject is over and against the object, and etc. And so this is really binary understanding, and postmodernism wants to resolve that binary, but it doesn't really. It actually dissolves it. And we see this, for example, it doesn't kind of integrate gender identity next to, sexual nature. No, it fuses it. It dissolves the whole binary. I've read very serious, like academic papers, environmental papers, arguing that we should just dissolve the distinction between humans and nature, as if we can pretend that, talking to a tree is the same as talking to a human. And so I think that this is also where postmodernism runs into its own limitations. It knows these binaries are problematic, but the only thing it can do is dissolve it. And this is our task, is to come to a real integration.
Yeah. All right, Steve and then John. And let's try to make it brief just so we can get through.
I'll just say thank you. I'm done. No, just kidding. I'm another Steve here. Annick, thank you. I wanted to latch on to the cultural moderation proposal you mentioned. And my question was, is the cultural moderation that may be needed for future leadership out of this mess, is it only possible for someone with an integral worldview, in which case is our only hope an army of integral Ken Wilber readers to take over politics and policy, yeah, just that idea of cultural moderation seems to require being able to see all these different worldviews. And is that prevalent outside of this little Zoom room here?
Well, you know, I have to think. I was listening to an interview with, what's his name, Chris Murphy, I think Senator of Connecticut, last week, and he was so reasonable and eloquent, and I was all impressed. And then at some point he started to talk about policy position. He actually started to talk about the trans issue, and then he kind of showed that he could not really see beyond that perspective, and this made me think that, yeah, so on the one hand, we need to be able to look a little bit beyond our worldview, but also we just need better thinking. I find that when you look into these issues that, you know, this is a very intelligent senator. You know, I listen to him and I'm like, wow, this, and, you know, super well intentioned. I really believe his full heart is into making the world a better place. But then when you start to talk about these concrete issues that, you know, arguably has lost us all these elections, and he can't seem to formulate even a rational standpoint around it. So, yeah, a new worldview to some degree is needed, but we don't all need to have that new worldview, right? You know, some people, and then these ideas can spread, and a little bit more critical self-investigation, where we really look, and in this case as the left, at what our positions are and what they're based on. If we go to that trans issue again, the belief in the left is that this is actually the just and the inclusive thing to do. But I think if you look at that position from just critical thinking, just rational critical thinking, you don't even need an integral worldview for that. You come to the conclusion, this is not just, and it's not inclusive either. It's actually exclusive and regressive rather than progressive. But somehow, you know, on this level of high level, very intelligent leaders, that thinking has not catched on. And yeah, so I think there's different pathways, and we don't all need this really deep change.
Yeah. I thought it was fascinating the way you connected the traditionalists' kind of fixation on borders with the gender identity and the sex identity almost being this stand-in of a border that's being, you know, ripped down by postmodernism. So
yeah, totally. And I think also that people have experienced it that way. Like, you're ripping my world apart.
right.
You know, this philosophy or this ideology is ripping people with more traditional worldviews apart.
All right. Well, let's give Annick a big round of applause. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. I feel like we could just keep the conversation going, but we've all got to get to other things. One last little announcement. Next month's meeting is on Wednesday, June 11th. It's always the second Wednesday of the month. Our presenter will be Diane Hamilton. And for those of you who are wondering about Matt Segal, he's going to be joining us. He had to reschedule for October, so he'll be back just later. So y'all have a wonderful rest of your evening, and we'll see you next month. Thanks,
Annick. Thanks, Rigel.
Yeah,
thanks everyone for showing up. Great to see everybody.
Great space.
Right.
Thank
Be
you.
well.